Advanced Psychoproctology for Beginners, Ahole Diagnosis, Treatment, and Prevention with Dr. Jeremy Sherman.
Welcome to Class 4 of this Advanced Psychoproctology course for beginners. I'll start with a review of where we've been. Psychoproctology originates with a premise, which I'll expand a bit here. Circumstances change. We humans struggle to keep up. We need to stay adaptive, changing with circumstances. Adaptation has always been a trial and error process. You try out different things and see what works. This commitment to trying different things means we can't impose some last word formula on how we all must live. Fundamentalism is hopeless. You can't just say, hey, from now on and forever, everybody has to walk this fine line. Look around the world and you'll see people living lots of different ways that work just fine. Live and let live is great, especially if you don't have to live with those who rub you wrong, and mostly you don't. You have some freedom of association and dissociation. Tolerance of diversity is crucial to our trial and error adaptive survival. Diversity is a source of variety, the trials in life's trial and error process, especially for us humans, because someone exploring far away might land on a useful adaptation that we can pick up quickly. Life is like a search party searching for adaptive solutions. A search party fans out. It doesn't walk a fine line. Still, we have to figure out how to name and tame, spot and stop, diagnose and humble aholes, or our society can't stay adaptive. In other words, we can't tell everyone how to live, but we still have to prevent people from becoming aholes. That flips morality on its head. Instead of telling everyone what they have to do, focus on the one thing that we all shouldn't do. Stop shoulding and start shouldn'ting, but carefully, which is why we're going to all this trouble to distinguish aholes. Do your thing. Be what you want to be. Find a life that suits you. Just don't be an a-hole. If you're becoming an a-hole, we'll try to stop you. Psychoproctology is thus about spotting and stopping aholes. And this premise poses psychoproctology's two main questions. First, there's diagnosing aholes. What distinguishes them? Then there's stopping or taming aholes. How can we undermine them without becoming aholes ourselves? In Class 2, we reviewed objections to psychoproctology, reasons I've been given for why we can't or shouldn't try to name or tame aholes. And I gave my reasons why, despite those objections, I remain a psychoproctologist. In Class 3, we dug into the first question, what makes an ahole an ahole? And a reminder, we're using the term ahole as a space holder. Once we have a more rigorous sense of what distinguishes them, we can find more precise terms for ahole behavior and the aholes who engage in it. In Class 3, we worked through a process of elimination, exploring the various ways people think that they can identify aholes that don't work. We ended with this question. If you can't identify aholes by their cause, passion, biography, motives, style, demographics, power, consequences, cheap rhetoric, logic, or the way they make us feel bad, what's the alternative? Now, here I could just pull something out of my butt, some standard that feels right to me. I could give you examples that fit that standard. I could ignore examples that don't fit it, and we'd be done with a beginner's psychoproctology course. But this is an advanced course for beginners, so I'm not going to do that. Well, what's my alternative? How can we categorize aholes more objectively? What standard should we use to find a more objective standard? Today we're going to talk about methodology, how to best shop among possible categorization standards, how to decide what makes someone an ahole. Remember, categorizing people as aholes is a dangerous business. Some of the worst crimes in history have been perpetrated by people who categorized aholes by gut intuition, fake objectivity, massacring millions by some fluid hardline, sloppy absolute standard for what makes someone an a-hole. Hitler categorized all Jews as a-holes. Chinese and Soviet communist leaders categorized all capitalists as a-holes, and plenty of libertarians categorize all communists as a-holes. Chinese and Soviet communist leaders categorized all capitalists as a-holes, and plenty of libertarians categorize all communists as a-holes. Plenty of dictators want to suppress all a-holes, defined as the people who disagree with them. We must do better than that. In defining a-holes, we're looking to categorize as objectively as possible. Ideally, we'd want a categorization that encompasses all a-holes and excludes all non-a-holes. So to explore methodology, we're going to focus first on categorization more generally. There's an old Buddhist story of a master butcher who never had to sharpen his knife because he always cut carcasses at their proper joints. Playing off this story, scientists and philosophers often talk of cutting reality at its proper joints. In other words, categorizing accurately. If we don't know where the real joints are, for example, the joint between aholes and non-aholes, we make a bloody mess, cutting through bone the way that blunt knife boneheads like Hitler did. The undercurrent running through all philosophy and science is an attempt to keep learning where the proper joints are, correcting for two kinds of mistakes: thinking there's a joint where there isn't one and not noticing a joint where there is one. To illustrate, suppose we said that aholes are utterly different from us. They're like another species, monsters as distinct from humans. They lie and we don't. That's an example of thinking there's a joint where there isn't one, that humans are one bone and aholes are another. We call that making a false distinction, saying two things are distinct when in fact they're one. Aholes lie, but so do we all. Someone might therefore conclude that we're all aholes. Hitler could say, sure, I lied to kill millions, but you lie too, so what's the difference? There is a difference between an a-hole and ordinary people who occasionally do nasty things. To pretend there isn't a difference is to think there's no joint where there is one. That error is called a false equivalent. So where would we draw the line between a-holes and non-a-holes so we make neither mistake, neither false distinctions nor false equivalences? And how would we even know whether we had made one or both of those sloppy moves? Here's a problem that's been lurking under this class so far. I've already made lots of assumptions about who the a-holes are. In the last session, when I had rejected certain standards because they excluded some a-holes, by what standard did I come up with those examples of a-holes? Did I just pull them out of my butt? Maybe I work from popular assumptions. I've mentioned Hitler more than a few times here. I could get away with it because most people think he was an a-hole. But in that I'd be engaging in the ad populism fallacy mentioned in the last class. It must be true because most people believe it. I keep in mind a piece of graffiti I once saw. Eat shit. 3 gazillion flies can't be wrong. Of course, flies are right about fly, but not human diets. In nature's trial and error process, eating shit has worked well for flies. Still, I think you get the point. I'm betting you can think of some things that most people believe that aren't true, or at least something that most people thought was true until we changed our minds about it. So I'm out on a bit of a limb in assuming that Hitler is an a-hole, or as I've already snuck in here, my premise that a-holes want to get the last word. I can't escape all assumptions. I never get what philosophers call the view from nowhere, the unbiased assumption-free starting point for all of my assumptions. No one can. Where we stand depends on where we sit, and the biases that we have accumulated as a result. Okay, so can we just deduce an objective way to categorize a-holes, the way that mathematicians deduce logical truths? It's tempting to think that we can, and has been since Plato dreamed of deducing the one true, pure and perfect definition of virtue, whereby you cut reality at its proper joints, distinguishing between virtuous and non-virtuous acts. We might dream of being able to deduce the proper joint between vice and non-vice, a-hole and non-a-hole. That dream died a few deaths in the last century in both logic and math. Still, people continue to talk as though they're just working from data neutrally, plugged into the variables in logical formulas to discover the irrefutable truth. Plugging data into variables is a categorization problem. Which data goes into which categories? The dream of plugging data into logic and generating irrefutable truths was kept alive for millennia by the allure of deduction, a logical process that by itself is airtight. Deduction is applying a general rule to a particular case. Here's the classic example used to illustrate deduction. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. The general rule is that all men are mortal. The particular case or data point is Socrates, who is a man. And yes, if Socrates is snugly in the category man, and man is snugly in the category mortal, then the conclusion is irrefutable. Socrates is mortal. On our topic, we could try a rule like this. All liberals are a-holes. Joe's a liberal, therefore Joe's an a-hole. Now you might wonder where we get the general rule that all liberals are a-holes, and well you should. If you start with the wrong general rule, you'll end up with incorrect conclusions. All men are ducks, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is a duck. Garbage in, garbage out. So how do we come up with general rules? That's called induction. It's deriving general rules from particular cases or data points. Switch the order of those 3 statements and you have an induction. Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal, therefore all men are mortal. Or Joe is a liberal, Joe is an a-hole, therefore all liberals are a-holes. Induction is not airtight. Just because one man is mortal, we can't conclude that all men are mortal. Just because one liberal is an a-hole, we can't conclude that all are. We strengthen inductions by adding more cases. John is a man and John is mortal. Brad is a man and mortal. Likewise, if you encounter a lot of liberals who you decide are all a-holes, you'll start to assume a general rule that maybe all liberals are a-holes. But maybe is all you get from induction. Unlike deduction, induction isn't conclusive, or by the time it's conclusive, it's not useful to us. We want general rules so we can make confident predictions. We would have to wait for all men to die before we knew for absolute certain that all men are mortal. With all men dead, the general rule that all men are mortal has no predictive utility. So we live with some uncertainty about inductions. As the philosopher Bertrand Russell illustrated it, consider the turkey. Every day the farmer visits bringing food. By induction, the turkey might draw the general rule that all farmer visits mean the turkey eats. But on Thanksgiving Eve, the farmer brings an axe instead of food. Deduction is irrefutable, but it rests on general rules that aren't. And induction is just half the problem. Induction deals with correlations between categories, for example, between the category man and the category mortal, or the category liberal and the category a-hole. But how do we even decide that something fits in a category? How do we decide that Socrates belongs in the category man? How do we decide that Joe is a liberal? To understand categorization, we can switch the order on those three statements yet again. Man is mortal, Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates is man. Or for categorizing Joe as a liberal, liberals are a-holes, Joe is an a-hole, therefore Joe is a liberal. What's the logical process by which we decide whether something or someone fits a category? It's not applying a general rule to a case, that's deduction. It's not using cases to build toward general rules, that's induction. It's something else that you know well from watching murder mysteries or finding your car in a big parking lot. It's finding traits in common. If it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, you start to assume it's a duck, that sort of thing. Since men and Socrates are both mortal, we might guess that Socrates belongs in the category man. We categorize by finding traits in common between things. It's called abduction, and like induction, it's far from airtight. After all, ducks are mortal, Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates is a duck. You're in the parking lot looking for your car. You find a car that has some features in common with yours, and you assume it's yours. It usually is, but sometimes it isn't. You try the key. If it works, off you go. If it doesn't, maybe you notice that unlike yours, this car has a baby seat in the back. This car and your car are the same color, make, and model, but no, wrong car. Or you've got this murderer and you've got this suspect. You look for traits they have in common so you can categorize them as one and the same. In the mystery novel, the murderer and the butler both had a motive, both had red hair, both were at the scene of the crime. So you conclude that the suspect is the murderer, though, as with the baby seat, you could be wrong. Maybe the butler didn't do it. Abduction is categorizing things because they have traits in common, which includes even just deciding that two things are the same, no joint between them. We employ abduction all the time without thinking about it. You do it when your friend is out of the room for a few minutes and comes back in. Same traits as the friend who left, so you abduce it's the same friend. And it probably is. And it probably is, unless your friend and their identical twin are playing tricks on you. In sum, deduction is airtight. If all men are mortal, and Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal, no question about it. But there's no deduction without underlying inductions, like all men are mortal, or abductions, like Socrates is a man. Induction and abduction are fallible. They can fail. Socrates is not a duck even though he and ducks are mortal. The butler didn't do it, and that's not your car after all. By now in the course, we're operating on the assumption that there are a-holes, but we can't compare suspected a-holes to a set of verified a-holes. You have your car to compare to other cars in the lot. Detectives have a murderer to compare to suspects, but we don't have a prototype for an a-hole. Now, you may think we do in extreme cases like Stalin, Hitler, or even Trump, and maybe we do. When asked what distinguishes or defines a-holes, lots of people will give you examples. An a-hole is someone who acts like Hitler. It's from such extreme examples that we can safely assume that a-holes exist. But notice how little help those extremes are for practical purposes. To cut reality at its proper joints means focusing in on the gray areas, not the extremes. We can't find the fine line between a-holes and non-a-holes by saying that a-holes are like Hitler and non-a-holes are like Martin Luther King. I've said a few times that we're looking for the most objective distinction possible. What do I mean by objective? I mean accurate, but I also mean what we call operationalized. An operational definition is one that anyone could apply with the same effect. You could hire someone to apply it, and they'd succeed in categorizing the way you mean to categorize. Imagine hiring some stranger to interact with a bunch of people and sort them out into categories, aholes and non-aholes. How would you instruct your hire? You can't say, people like Hitler over here, people like MLK over there. Too vague, too subjective. We don't have a perfect model of the ideal a-hole, and even if we did, it wouldn't solve our categorization problem. Suppose Hitler was the ideal a-hole. What traits would suspected a-holes have to have in common with Hitler such that you could confidently identify suspects as real a-holes? That they're nationalist, German-speaking, short, mustached, Jew-killing? Not having an ideal to compare to is a problem, but it's not going to stop us. It does stop us, however, from claiming the last word on categorizing a-holes. That's why I said that psychoproctology is a fruitful exercise in futility. We'll never get the last word objective definition of a-holes. Still, we can do better than we do currently, and it's well worth trying because we can't have an adaptive society if we can't stop a-holes, and we can't stop a-holes unless we can identify them more accurately than any of the criteria we tried and found wanting in Class 3. Now, the scientific method has a way of addressing the categorization question that you may not have heard much about, since scientists assume it more than they assert it. You've probably heard about multidisciplinary approaches, mixing and matching across different areas of research. Science seeks more than a multidisciplinary approach. For example, you're not going to get physicists who explain that the moon pulls on the tides by citing ideas in psychology, as though the moon is motivated to pull on the tides. Science isn't multidisciplinary so much as it's sequidisciplinary. It assumes a sequence to research disciplines. Scientific evidence suggests an order by which things have come into being in our universe. Scientists assume, for example, that physical and chemical phenomena existed before biological behavior, which existed before psychological behavior. In other words, there was matter before there was mind. Of course, lots of religions and spiritualities say that mind existed before matter. For example, that God's mind created the physical universe. The evidence doesn't suggest it. The universe is 14 billion years old. Of all the evidence we've found, there's no phenomena in the first 10 billion years that can't be explained with physics and chemistry alone. Nothing before life that must be explained as a product of things trying to do anything, the way we living beings struggle for our existence. In other words, for roughly 2/3 of those 14 billion years, all detected phenomena make sense by means of the physical sciences, not the life and social sciences. And anyway, humans are late to this party. About that much we all agree. There were critters long before there were humans, and therefore biology long before psychology. So for science, there's a sequence to phenomena. Chemistry comes before biology, biology comes before psychology. In science, the assumption is that the lower sciences must explain what the higher sciences assume. We must explain a category like human consciousness from biology and explain biology from chemistry. We must get the sciences in the right sequence and make the earlier sciences explain the emergence of the qualities assumed by the later ones. If we don't do that, we're categorizing more by impressionistic feel than by science. So, rather than pulling out my butt some intuitive definition for a-holes that I defend with less care than I gave to attacking those other definitions in Class 3, I'm going to take a different route forward. I'm going to go backward, way backward, and here's why. In biology, there are plenty of aggressive predators, but, I'll argue, no a-holes. We may be hounded by beasts, persecuted by sharks, or cornered by viral pandemics, but that's different from dealing with a-holes and cults. A-holes and cults are human phenomena. So in the next class, I'm going to start with a little about the origins of life's struggle for existence from chemistry, and from there get into what makes humans so radically different from other organisms. I'm going to come at the question of what distinguishes an a-hole by explaining rather than just assuming categories. To categorize a-holes accurately, I have to explain their emergence and evolution. I mentioned that half my time is devoted to research into two big scientific questions: the origin of life and the difference between the rest of life and us humans. I've been doing this research for 25 years with a former Harvard professor of biology, now at UC Berkeley. We have careful scientific guesses about the origins of life and how language makes humans a different kind of critter, adapting to reality differently in all the obvious ways if you compare your life to that of a dog, or a potato bug, fish, lily, or bacterium. Our research team has bets about the origins of life and the evolution of humans that lead me to bets about what makes aholes. In other words, I've got an explanation for aholes that starts with chemistry, which explains life, which explains humans, which explains aholes. Now, our explanation could well be wrong. You don't have to believe me just because I work with a Harvard Berkeley scientist. There are lots of them, and many probably wouldn't agree with us. I said in class 1 that one can't work in science without the possibility that you'll end up spending your whole life barking up the wrong trees. In science, no one gets the last word. While there are plenty of confident, even arrogant scientists, in the long run and overall, science itself offers them no safe harbor. There are no sacred texts in science. There are revered texts, but any text can be overthrown by next texts. Every theory in science is provisional, to be beaten by a better theory if one comes along. Science is fallible. Our best guesses today could prove wrong. Science is adaptive to new situations and new insights. It's a fussy human continuation of the trial and error process that got life this far along. We call science falliblist, and as mentioned in the last class, I'm a falliblist too. No matter how confident I am in a bet, I'm still more confident that it is a bet, not a certainty, not the last word. Being a falliblist is very different from saying every bet is just as probable, or that you never can tell anything, or you should doubt everything always, or that there's no reality. No, some bets are better than others. It's just that none are last word infallible. Fallibilism is going to be necessary to our whole approach here, and, as I've hinted already, I'll argue that aholes are absolute anti-fallibilists. They're infallibilists. They play God, eternally right, righteous, and mighty. I think the biggest, longest culture war, and not just its current manifestations, is the battle between fallibilists and infallibilists. It's a war between people who make confident bets that they know could be wrong, and people who insist, for whatever reason, that their bets are not bets, they're absolute certainties. They don't have to believe they're certainties, they just have to act like they are, which is why we call them know-it-alls or aholes. While an ahole's disrespect for the guesswork of life may strike you as immoral and wrong-headed, I'll also be arguing here that being an ahole is natural, understandable, and not some rare pathology. Who among us wouldn't like to feel invulnerable to challenges? Who doesn't resist self-doubt? Who doesn't like having to trudge slowly up some learning curve to better bets? On top of that, pretending you're infallible can be very successful. Look at Trump, Hitler, and Stalin. They all ran the gauntlet through society, climbed up to an ivory tower of absolute self-certainty, and did well for themselves. There's a philosopher named Karl Popper who is famous for having pointed the way to fallibilism. It's ironic because he was famously stubborn and confident. Still, his theory is about how there are no last words. He argued that science can only deal with what he called falsifiable theories, theories that could be tested against evidence such that they can be proven wrong. He said you can never prove a theory right. There are no last words in science. Instead, science works by a process of elimination, much like what we did in Class 3 with common standards for distinguishing aholes. You try out theories by trial and error, and the eliminated theories are demoted or rejected. For that to work, argued Popper, theories have to be vulnerable, or in his terminology, falsifiable. A non-falsifiable theory has no place in science. If you have a theory that can't fail no matter what evidence you throw at it, it's not subject to trial and error, and therefore has no place in science's trial and error process. Popper was inspired to his approach by his frustration reading Freud, who had an explanation for everything. No matter what a person did, Freud could explain it as consistent with his theory. As such, Freud's theories were non-falsifiable. No matter what evidence you threw at Freud, he could always say, exactly, that affirms my theory. A non-falsifiable theory is a know-it-all theory, but also an explain-it-all theory. While such theories have no place in science, they have a big place in the human heart. Take a popular religious theory like it's all God's infallible plan, or variations on it in spirituality like everything happens for a reason, it's all good, or everything that happens to us is the universe trying to teach us something. These theories have phenomenal resonance with people, and are they testable? Can you subject them to a trial and error process to determine whether they're errors? Not really. No matter what examples you pose to someone who claims that it's all God's plan, they would say, exactly, that too proves it's all God's plan. Challenge a religious fundamentalist on the evidence of extinct organisms. If it's all God's infallible plan, why are there fossils? They can say that those fossils are evidence of God's plan. God buried those fossils to trick us, to test our faith in God's infallible plan. They're fake, put here by God as part of his plan. Yup, that affirms my theory. This appetite for infallible theories isn't just religious or spiritual, though there are advantages to relying on the supernatural as the source of non-falsifiable explanations. The supernatural is permanently off limits to the trial and error process. By definition, it's not natural, and therefore never testable against any natural evidence. And it's super, above the natural. You can believe anything you want about it. But you'll notice too that Trump or Stalin don't have to rely on religion's non-falsifiable theories, and Freud didn't either. There are secular non-falsifiable theories too. Make America Great Again is a non-falsifiable theory. Everything Trump does makes America great again, and everything his opponents do is an attempt to keep him from making America great again. It's all part of Trump's non-falsifiable plan. Suppose I had a theory that all Muslims are terrorists, a general rule that I wanted to treat as non-falsifiable. I can apply it to particular cases. I'm introduced to Ali, and by deduction, I assume he's a terrorist. All Muslims are terrorists. Ali is a Muslim. Therefore, Ali is a terrorist. Suppose I'm told that Ali is not a terrorist. If I assume my general rule is infallible, I have two choices. I can claim that Ali must not be a Muslim, or that it's a lie, that Ali really is a terrorist. It's far easier to recategorize than to change general rules. If you change general rules, you may have to recategorize all past cases. You may have to deal with subtler categorizations, for example, between ISIS members and Sufi Muslims. Above all, you have to deal with probabilities, which is more of a fuss than black and white thinking. You'll also have to deal with doubt. With enough doubt, you'll have to deal with self-doubt too. Doubt about whether you have what it takes to deal with all of the doubts you're dealt. Returning to the question I started with here, if we can't distinguish aholes by all the criteria listed in Class 3, what else is there? I'll be making the case that we can distinguish aholes by what they get for being aholes: freedom from doubt, freedom from self-doubt, and often substantial power advantages for minimal effort. Non-falsifiability is how aholes can give the false, yet alluring impression of an unbroken winning streak. The appetite for such non-falsifiable, untestable theories is strong, not just in religion and spirituality, and as we'll see, it's no mystery why. People say that crime doesn't pay. We hope it doesn't pay, but people don't say we hope it doesn't pay. We say it doesn't. Is that wishful thinking or a realistic description? A likable story or a likely one? Is there some natural law that prevents crime from paying? Do chickens always come home to roost? Are there no free lunches? Does every criminal get their comeuppance? If so, how long does it take? A week, a year, a lifetime? The evidence suggests crime often pays, and so does being an a-hole. We have to make an ongoing effort to prevent crime and aholery from paying. Being an a-hole often rewards a-holes, sometimes with benefits sustained right up to death. Stalin, who killed more people than even Hitler, died a normal death. Again, if there were a God, heaven and hell would be the least he could do to redress the injustices of earthly life. The law is how we try to keep crime from paying, but we don't have the equivalent for aholery. If we did, we wouldn't have an a-hole like Trump rising above the law. We have education and social services to prevent the rise of aholery, but apparently they're not keeping up. Okay, summing up, we've been exploring how to categorize a-holes more rigorously than pulling categories out of our gut intuition and defending them because they feel right. Realistic categorization is cutting reality at its proper joints, which is a problem since we can't compare it to reality's proper joints. You can't compare two pictures if you only have one of them. I admitted to having smuggled in some intuitions in my attempts to categorize a-holes realistically. For example, that a-holes claim to have the last word. And I argued that one can't escape all assumptions. Rather, one must do one's best to expose the assumptions, put them on the table where we can keep our eyes on them. We also explored how logic doesn't get us to infallible categorization. Sometimes things walk and talk like a duck, but aren't ducks. We visited a goal of science. The earlier sciences, like physics and chemistry, must explain what the later sciences, like biology and psychology, assume, which points to where we're going in the next class, a natural history of a-holes, starting all the way back with the emergence of life and the evolution of language in humans, to get to an explanation for humankind's a-hole tendencies. And finally, through thinking about science, we revisited the trial and error nature of fallibilism. And why again? Because that's the stand we'll have to maintain as we do battle with a-holes without becoming a-holes ourselves. We'll have to be confident in our bets, but still more confident that they are bets. There are better and worse, but no last word bets. In this advanced course in psychoproctology for beginners, we're looking for better bets on how to categorize people as a-holes. And once we have a better bet on categorization, better bets on ways to stop them. Before I stop here, I'm going to recite a short poem I wrote to frame up my relationship with a-holes. To address our second question, how to stop a-holes without becoming one, I've cultivated exchanges with trolls. Here's a poem about those interactions. It's short and not mushy like some poems. I try to be a nice guy, but if you show up done, ready for a fight, you're already sure you've won. I'm going to do my best to have you leave here disappointed, with your scheme to dip in quick, pre and post anointed, as the one who only tutors, teaching others what to think, because it's attitudes like that that put the whole world on the brink. Thanks for listening.